reach to people who we wouldn't have been able to invite otherwise. So tonight we have Máximo Sozzo. I'm not going to say much about it because our director today is going to be Oliver. So I just want to welcome you all. Remind you that we have a film screening next Monday, as well as a conversation with the Brazilian film director, Sandra Kogut. So I invite you all to that meeting next week. And I have to say that this event is going to be recorded. So I need to announce this to all of you, so you are aware. And then I will pass on to our very own Oliver Wilson-Nunn, who is co-hosting today this event. And I just want to thank you, Máximo, for accepting our invitation to share your work with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Máximo Sozzo, Professor of Sociology and Criminology at the Universidad Nacional del Litoral in Argentina. Among the most eminent figures in Latin American criminology, Máximo has published over 100 articles and book chapters in the field, ranging from historical studies of the scientific representation of the criminal in 19th century Argentina, through to analyses of policing after dictatorship and contemporary prison education programs. Máximo has also published numerous books, including Southern Criminology, alongside Kerry Carrington, Russell Hogg, John Scott, and Rhys Walters in 2019, and The Political Economy of Punishment Today, Visions, Debates, and Challenges in 2018, alongside Dario Melosi and José Brandariz García. In 2021, he will publish Las Metamorfosis de la Penalidad del Siglo XXI, as well as Prisons, Inmates, and Power in Latin America with Palgrave. I'm delighted that he's joining us today for a talk entitled The Punitive Turn in Latin America. Before we continue, I'd just like to say, if you have questions, please write them in the chat box. But without further ado, over to you, Máximo.
Thank you very much, Oliver and Felipe. Thank you for this very kind invitation. I am very happy to be here, at least on an online way, to share some thoughts about the punitive term in Latin America. As you all know, this process, what we label the punitive term, is one of the most striking phenomena that we can see around the criminal question in our region in the last 3 decades. So I will share my screen because I organized a powerful presentation. Let's see if I can do it well. Well, here I am. It's working well, yeah? I think so. So one of the first points I want to address is the idea of the punitive term that is connected with the more general concept of punitiveness. From my perspective, punitiveness is the level of human pain or suffering produced by penality. Penality in its own nature has as a main character the production of human pain and suffering. So I am in some way displacing my way of understanding punitiveness from several authors who have presented this idea with a connotation, with a meaning of abuse or excess. So of course, it's very difficult to build empirical indicators about human suffering, about human pain. We can consider 2 main dimensions: the extension of penalty and the intensity of penalty, the extension of human suffering, the intensity of human suffering. One of the main empirical indicators that have been used in the punishment and society literature in the last years is, of course, the incarceration rate. That has a lot of limitations, as the literature has discussed in the last years, but also is one of the few available for international comparisons. That is why it's widely used. And I will also use it in my own presentation. Also considering the restricted possibilities to build empirical indicators in the case of Latin America, that are so many, and we can come back in the Q&A to this point. So the punitive term means a substantial growth of punitiveness. Of course, the question is one of magnitude. How much punitiveness has to grow in order to understand that we are confronting a punitive term. There is, of course, the key example of the USA, beyond many other indicators of penal expansion and intensification. The incarceration rate grew from 162 per 100,000 inhabitants in 1970 to 639 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants in 2018, reaching even 755 in 2008. So more than a quadruplication in 4 decades. So if we look at the evolution of the incarceration rates in Latin America, very rapidly, we can see that in all the countries in Latin America in the last 3 decades, from 1990 to 2020, we have witnessed a strong growth of the incarceration rate. If we look at the percentages of growth, we can see also that this huge growth of the incarceration rates has a lot of variations from El Salvador to Chile. So we can talk of a common trend during these last 3 decades, but also recognizing the existence of variation, of a strong variations. And if you want, we can come back to this later, exploring in more detail some of the cases of a smaller growth in incarceration rates like Chile or Mexico. So one of the main ideas is that despite all this variation, we can find that 13 out of 18 Latin American countries at least duplicated their incarceration rates in 3 decades. So if we make a fast comparison with the English-speaking world, as you can see in this table, if we go back to the percentages of growth in Latin American countries, with many countries with more than 300% of growth, and we compare it with several English-speaking countries in the last 3 decades, we can see that, the worst in terms of incarceration growth was Australia, with a growth of 90% during the 3 decades. But even we can see easily that in some countries as South Africa, we can see that these countries have experienced a decrease in the incarceration rate during the same period. Of course, there is a huge international debate on the punitive term, and the weight of the case of the USA in this debate is very, very strong, because it was an extreme and early case, and also because there is a strong development and institutionalization of punishment and society studies in the academic world in the USA. This work has been strongly attractive for Latin American scholars in order to think about the punitive term. And there are multiple reasons that we can think about this strong influence. First, the existence in many national cases in Latin America of comparable harsh penal trends. Second, the importation from the USA of ideas and practices of crime control in several Latin American countries. And third, and very important from my perspective, the traditional dependency and subordination in the production of knowledge between the global North and the global South, that in some ways is common for all the social sciences, but particularly for the social studies around crime and punishment. So during the 1990s and the 2000s, several interpretative frameworks to understand the punitive term focused on the USA case emerged. 2 were particularly used to think about Latin American cases. First, the thesis of late modern penality that is associated with the name of David Garland, particularly. In this thesis, in this approach, the strategy of punitive segregation, as Garland labeled it, is part of the ambivalent state responses to a new experience of crime, a new experience of crime that is related to the growth of crime and the normalization of high crime rates in contemporary societies, that in turn is linked to a multidimensional process that is at the same time economic, social, political, and cultural of the transition from modernity to the late modernity. The thesis of the neoliberal penalty that is usually associated with the work by Loïc Vaquant includes the punitive term as part of neoliberalism, as a transnational political project that has produced several transformations of the state, but fundamentally a minimization of social interventions by the state and a change of its logic, and a maximization of the penal interventions of the state and a change of its logic as a new mode of governance of social marginality in contemporary societies. These two theses, these two approaches, these two frameworks have many differences between them. And in punishment and society studies in the last 20 years, we have witnessed a lot of theoretical debate around both positions. But I think that they share three interrelated characteristics that we can consider common underground features. First, the identification of the sources of the punitive term in deep or background causes that are thought in different ways, but always are considered structural, macroscopic processes, late modernity or neoliberalism. In their less cautious versions, these different deep causes are elevated to the status of an epochal change. Second, an obsession with change that deviates attention from inertia and constructs simplified visions about the past. In the less cautious versions, the past is vanished or is about to vanish in our present, and even in some cases is considered with a nostalgic attitude. And third, the engines of the punitive term identified by these different interpretative frameworks, late modernity or neoliberalism, are by definition destined to cross borders. As a consequence, in their less cautious versions, they extended their arguments not only to other contexts of the global north, but even to contexts of the global south. These theses, these approaches have been used to think about the punitive term in a specific national context of Latin America, or in more ambitious attempts about the whole region. In some occasions, the analysis produced in this way were connected only to one of these interpretative frameworks, but it was not infrequent to find combinations of these different perspectives, exploring spaces of intersection that were already present in the original elaborations in relation to the global north. So in these two approaches, we can see different obstacles in order to make them useful to understand the punitive term in Latin America. And we can discuss a lot about this because I am very interested on these limitations of these kind of approaches, but I will only take a couple of points about these obstacles. So in the case of the neoliberal penalty thesis, as is well known, this approach has a strong appeal to Latin American scholars because since the 1970s, as we all know, in many national contexts of Latin America, we have witnessed dramatic neoliberal reforms with equally dramatic economic and social effects. These theses have many problems that have been also discussed in the punishment and society literature in the global north. But one paramount obstacle in Latin America, from my perspective, is how to deal with the processes of post-neoliberal political change since the end of the 1990s. You know, the more radical cases of Venezuela since 1999, Bolivia since 2006, and Ecuador since 2007, but also the less radical cases of Brazil since 2003, Argentina since 2003, and Uruguay since 2005. All these political processes have produced strong governmental alliances and programs that were based on promises of rupture with the neoliberal past. Of course, the level or the degree of realization of these promises varies a lot between the different national contexts, but we cannot consider these moments in our recent history as a mere continuity with the neoliberal past. The example of Ecuador is very interesting in this sense, as we can see in this graph. During the period between 1990 and 2005, the incarceration rates in Ecuador oscillated very strongly, but within moderate limits between 61 and 87 per 100,000 inhabitants. You know, incarceration rates that were lower in comparison with all the English-speaking countries during this period, with the exception of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So after the political change began in 2007, we can see a strong volatile trend with an upward trend first and then a downward trend later. But since 2009, there was a huge punitive term in Ecuador with a growth of 153% of the incarceration rate in between 2006 and 2016, so in less than a decade. This extraordinary growth can be explained through the a combination of elements, the politicization of crime and punishment, despite the decline of violent crime in Ecuador that was so strong during those years, the failed coup d'etat in 2010 and its political effects, the changes in the governmental alliance and rhetoric of the Alianza País, the government by President Correa, the process of criminal justice reform and police reform, and with the language of modernization and the growing state capacity. We could come back to this, but we could consider the example of Ecuador as a clear example of a post-neoliberal punitive term. So also around the late modern penalty thesis, we can discuss a lot, so I will pick only one point. The role of the growth of crime, particularly violent crime, related to the multidimensional change towards late modernity is a key element in the new experience of crime and of the state responses, including the punitive segregation strategy in this account. But the problem is that in many Latin American cases in which there was a strong incarceration rate increase, there was no growth of violent crime. And we have many examples like Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Panama, etc. So if we look at the evolution of intentional homicide rates in Latin America, we have weak data also in relation to this phenomenon, and we could come back to the discussion about this data in the Q&A if you are interested. But if we take, for example, the example of Colombia, the trend is obviously a decreasing trend from 73 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in 1990 to 25 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in 2018. And in other cases, of course, the evolution of the intentional homicides is not so strong, but in any case, we are witnessing a decreasing trend, as I mentioned before, in the case of Argentina. So I think that we need to turn towards an alternative theoretical path. And I think that this alternative theoretical path needs to go beyond this kind of grand narratives under three common interrelated characteristics in order to understand the punitive term in Latin American context. For this, I mean that we have to displace ideas about an epochal change. We have to displace the obsession with change. And we also have to displace the idea that what happens in California happens all over the world. So this is, of course, a move that we can see also in the discussions about the punitive term in the global north, particularly in the USA. We can consider a lot of what has been labeled case studies, very detailed studies about penal trends in different states of the US that since the last part of the 2000s have shown us a more messy, hybrid, ambivalent landscape in penal trends, even in the case of the USA. So in dialogue with this kind of narratives, I think that we have to be strongly against overgeneralization. The exploration of the case of the US has produced valuable tools to think about the punitive term, but they have to be provincialized, situated in a specific temporal and spatial coordinates. This, of course, doesn't imply to overlook the processes of exportation of discourses and practices of crime control made in USA to Latin American countries. But these processes have to be the object of detailed inquiry, avoiding rapid assumptions that they are taking place out of superficial symptoms. And we have a lot of stories about this, for example, in relation to zero tolerance policy model in the case of Latin America. So my alternative path in some way tries to argue in favor of in-depth, thick reconstruction of empirical and historical processes, both in the past and the present, trying to find continuities and discontinuities in the penal field. This would recognize the embeddedness of punishment, as my colleague Dario Melosi has put it at the beginning of the 2000s. So the centrality of place in order to understand the practices and discourses about punishment, but also considering, as Nicola Lacey has put it 10 years ago, the risks to become mesmerized by the fascinating details of local peculiarity. It is crucial to recognize penal variation, penal heterogeneity. Just think about Canada in the context of the Americas. But we need a multiplication of specific narratives that need to aggregate upward and across jurisdiction. That is why I consider the task of comparison as a key element in the possibilities of generalization. I think this is crucial for studies about the global South, that could develop a truly decolonized conversation with the global North. So some glimpses about this alternative path, I will try to present some glimpses about this alternative path using the example of Argentina. This is the evolution of the incarceration rate in Argentina for a longer period, since 1972, the first year in which we have official data on this, in the second half of the 20th century, till today. So in the 1980s, the moment of transition to democracy was combined, in the case of Argentina, with a strong trend towards penal moderation. There were several penal initiatives that were produced by a network of liberal experts and politicians that were mainly initiatives of legal reform. There were limited interventions in that moment in the organizations and practices of crime control institutions. This was a moment in which crimes of the state produced by the dictatorships were at the center of the public and political debate. And these stories about crimes of the state during the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, in the other part of the decade, has produced a blockage of punitive discourses on street crime. Even in a situation of economic and political crisis and instability, the limited space of street crime in the public and political agenda is something very, very surprising from a certain point of view. And this was despite the strong growth of property and violent crimes during the 1980s in Argentina. This was translated in a certain stability of the level of punitiveness. We don't have national data for that period. As you can see, the last incarceration rate that we could see in the 1980s is for 1984. And then the series restarts in 1992. But if we use the provincial level data, in Argentina, we are a federal country with 25 different prison services. So if we use the data of the provincial level, we can see a strong stability in the level of incarceration. And even in the federal prisons during these 1980s, there was a 50% of decrease of the prison population. This has begun to change at the beginning of the 1990s with the radical neoliberal reforms. But in a first moment, the process linked to Menemismo as a governmental alliance program saw the persistence of penal initiatives toward penal moderation. that were produced in the same way as in the 1980s. So for example, the introduction of probation in Argentina was of 1994. But we can also see in that moment the encapsulated emergence of tough on crime measures, the new illicit drugs law of 1989, and the role of the federal government of the USA in producing that legal change, the creation of the first public office in charge of the war on drugs in Argentina in 1989. Also, we can see the beginning of the policy of oblivion of crimes of the state, or the consolidation of the policy of oblivion of crimes of the state, and the growing political weight of the military and the police sectors during the Menemist national or federal governments. This was, for example, translated in the creation of the Public Security Secretary in 1994, that was in charge first of an ex-military officer and then of an ex-police officer. At the same time, we can see in this moment the beginning of the criminal justice reforms that try to move from an inquisitorial model towards an adversary or accusatory model that in some way produce a growing state capacity in the field of criminal justice. This was combined with mixed outcomes. So a growth of incarceration at the federal level that was strongly connected with the new law on illegal drugs. So 43% of growth between 1989 and 1995, but a relative stability in the other jurisdictions. So the incarceration rate in 1995 was 21% less than in 1983. This process of change has gained strength in the second half of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, with the birth of a trend of punitive populism from above, as I label it in several texts. This was a context of growing social and economic crisis as a result of neoliberalization in the economic and social policies, but also a moment of political crisis for Menemism as a political alliance and program, a context of a growth of street crime, an increasing fear of crime, and social concern about crime that in combination produces strong politicization of crime and punishment. The governmental alliance in power in that moment, Menemism, produced for the first time an open rhetoric of mano dura, in which some sectors of the police forces, particularly of the federal police forces, play a very significant role. And the reaction of the political opposition was quite weak. And in that sense, there was a political process of construction of a certain degree of consensus that produced different initiatives towards increasing punitiveness at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. This was the moment also of the increasing role of the media in the debate about crime policy in Argentina, and the strong displacement of experts. The reference to what the people want became central in the construction of a heated public and political climate with a strong permeability of police and judicial actors to these public opinion trends that were perceived by these different sectors in the political and institutional arena. This was also combined with a strong new criminal justice reforms that have produced also a very important introduction of the language of efficacy and efficiency, the ideas of the new public management, as in the case of Buenos Aires province in 1997, or at the federal level in 1997. So the change of the federal government in 1999 produced afterwards a huge political crisis, the crisis of 2001, that reinforced the punitive trend. So the increase of punitiveness was 93% of the incarceration rate only between 1995 and 2003. So the political change that began in Argentina in 2003 has produced a strong penal volatility. So there were oscillations in the level of politicization of crime. So we have general elections during the Kirchnerist period in Argentina, in which the problem of crime was not at the center of the electoral debate, as the elections of 2007 or 2011, but also we have elections with a strong level of politicization of crime, as the ones of 2013 and 2015. Moments of strength and weakness of the Kirchnerist governmental alliance were strongly connected with the development of the punitive temptation, or the trend towards continuing the punitive populist strategy that was developed at the end of the 1990s. At the same time, in this heterogeneous governmental alliance, different sectors struggle against the punitive temptation and produce some very modest, very moderate measures in the field of crime policy, trying to prevent the levels of punitiveness to grow in that moment. The trend towards managerial reforms in criminal justice systems were particularly strong at the end of the 2000s in several jurisdictions. There were failed attempts to police reform also in several jurisdictions, both in the Buenos Aires province, in Santa Fe province, at the federal level. But these failed attempts produce an increase of budgets, an increase of state capacity that was very, very, very strong. At the end of this period between 2003 and 2015, we witnessed an increase of 23% of incarceration rate. And even in some jurisdictions, this modest increase didn't take place. For example, in Buenos Aires province, that the main prison service in Argentina, the growth of the people that were incarcerated was only of 8% if we consider not only the persons incarcerated in prisons, but also the persons incarcerated in police settings. So since 2015, with the right turn in the governmental alliance of the President Macri, we can see several developments that were connected with the acceleration of the increase of incarceration rate. The mano dura rhetoric came back with a strong tone in the governmental alliance. So, for example, the rebirth in Argentina of the theme of the connection between Latin American migration and crime was very, very strong during these 4 years, particularly at the beginning of these years. There were several measures trying to increase the severity of migration policy by President Macri. There were also strong measures of reinforcement of police autonomy that gives some of the more conservative sectors of the police forces a lot of strength in the design and implementation of public policy. There was in 2007 a regressive reform of prison law that in some way restricted the opportunities to be released from prisons. So in this context, in only 4 years, there was a 33% of growth of the incarceration rate, higher than the one observed between 2003 and 2005. So probably I am talking very, very fast, but sorry for that. But if we can consider these 5 moments, this story, this complex story that I only schematically presented to you, we can see that several of the main arguments in the debate about the punitive term, both in Global North and Global South, could be questioned from this set of evidence, from this exploration of from this in-depth or thick exploration of this case. So some ideas to conclude about what are the lessons that I think that we can take from this kind of exploration. First, the importance of exploring the proximate causes, as also David Garland has recently acknowledged and promoted. This means that asking the questions why and how are an interrelated effort, and we cannot only ask questions about background or deep causes, we also need to ask questions about how these processes produce penal decisions and outcomes. This means to pay attention to what Garland calls the translation process, or Pat O'Malley have referred as the transmission belt. But also we need to be very careful, because there are several limitations of this metaphor of mediation that could produce an idea that these proximate processes that are related to penal decisions and outcomes are only a reaction to background or deep processes and dynamics. So in general, I think that we need to build a mid-level, middle-range analysis in which macroscopic elements are conditions but not determinants. And this means, from my perspective, constructing a more political interpretation of penal change, in which politics, in a very broad sense, is central, is key. But beyond a voluntarist vision, of course, we could not consider that politics could produce whatever political and social actors imagine to produce. Context matters, macroscopic processes matters. So I think that there is a centrality in this sense of the legacies of the past. We could go back to this in the Q&A. I am already finishing my time, but you know, in the case of Argentina, it's crucial to understand this trend that in some way connects the legacies of the dictatorship to these police sectors that have been fighting against moderation in the penal realm, first in the 1990s, then in the 2000s, and now in the 2010s. And these police sectors, in some struggles, gain strength in order to influence political and penal decisions, as in the 1990s very clearly, and also again very clearly in the last 4 years of the government of President Macri. So legacies of the past of the dictatorships are very, very strong. And we can also consider this in relation to other kinds of pasts, not to the military dictatorship of the dictatorship past, but also, for example, considering the feedback effects of the criminal justice reforms. Many of these criminal justice reforms in favor of an accusatorial model of criminal justice were built out of liberal concerns, were built out of a language about the rule of law and human rights, but they have also produced a huge increase in state capacities. So when the political and cultural climate change, and this mano dura rhetoric in some way produce a lot of impact in the decisions, these criminal justice systems that were and are also very permeable to pressures from politics, from media, produced decisions of increasing punitiveness. So institutional features in the production of penal and political decisions can matter also, but more as conditions than as determinants of penal decisions and outcomes. At the end, I think that to understand the punitive term, we have to build an approach that could give room to the importance of the struggles around the power to punish, an actor-centered agonistic perspective, as our colleagues Phelps, Page, and Goodman have recently also encouraged. Well, thank you. Sorry for being so fast. There was a lot of things to say in 40 minutes. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Maximo. That was really, really interesting. So as I was saying, if anyone has questions, please let me know through the chat box. Perhaps while people are thinking of questions and possible things to say, I could maybe start off with something. And I was interested in your discussion of the tendency or perhaps the urge in post-neoliberal Argentina to continue with the penal populism, as you described, from above. I was interested, and I know you discussed penal populism from below as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that and whether you see that as something which has continued or whether that itself might be something which is newer, and how we might be able to talk about that maybe at the scale of Latin America, and again, how that might link to the global north as well.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's a very important thing that I didn't mention, although I have planned my notes to go back to this. I think that, you know, in the debate about punitive populism, in general, in punishment and society studies in the last 20 years, we can see a way of understanding punitive populism that have highlighted what we can call a dynamic from below. So the idea would be that there was an increase on crime, and this increase in crime produced a huge level of fear of crime. Fear of crime produced crime anxiety, crime concern, and this is connected with punitive attitudes by sectors of the public. And you know, in this kind of narrative, the state actors just respond to these demands, these punitive demands from below, producing decisions and actions that increase the level of punitiveness. And I think that this of course could be said in some situations and contexts, but could not be generalized as the only dynamic in relation with punitive populism. So in the case of Argentina, I think it's a clear example that the birth of punitive populism was from above, from the elites, with a strong level of participation of key actors in the governmental alliance of Menemism at the end of the 1990s, with the key participation of journalists from different kinds of media that were quite aligned with Menemism as a political alliance and program. But at the beginning of the 2000s, and I think that in connection with this previous wave, emerged in Argentina, truly, you know, movements of punitive populism from below. We have this very strong case of the Axel Crusade that was after a scandal in relation with a case of kidnapping and murder. There was a huge level of mobilization, of social mobilization, that produced a strong pressure on the political field in order to produce decisions that increase punitiveness. So in 2004 and 5, 12 legal reforms were produced at the federal level, increasing the levels of punitiveness at the beginning of this Kirchnerist political alliance. And you could see in that moment very clearly how some sectors of that alliance were supporting the increase of punitiveness. So now it's a politician in the opposition, but the Miguel Pichetto, that was a senator in that moment, that was candidate to be vice president of President Macri in the last general election, was a clear case in this sense. So people reacting out of convenience or conscience, we don't know, but producing this kind of support to this wave of punitive populism from below. But also we can see in that alliance a lot of actors trying to resist that punitive populist trend. And I think that what has happened after that, you know, since 2005, shows us how much this punitive populist trend could be in some way handled by elite actors. Because when you watch the situation of the electoral competition in 2007 in the presidential elections in Argentina, you can see that crime is not there. Nobody talked about crime in the general elections of 2007. And the language of being tough on crime was quite marginal, with some candidates in the far right part of the political spectrum, but without gaining currency in the electoral debate. So I think that this process shows us that, you know, of course, there are trends from below, that there are demands, punitive demands in all our countries. And I think this is not only the case in Argentina, but also in other places. But we have also to understand how these demands are built and were built. And here again, the discourse about path dependence is very important. So when we know politicians have in some way gone through this path, it's very difficult for many of them to reconstruct their own positions around crime and punishment and build a more moderate discourse. And we have very clear examples even today with the new government in Argentina. So the president of the deputy chamber is Sergio Massa, is one of the key actors in maintaining the flame of the punitive discourse in the political sphere during the 2010s. And I think that we have to consider both things, the trends from below, but also how these interact with the trends from above. And I think that this changed our way of understanding punitive trends, because if not, we could fall in what Catherine Beckett 25 years ago called the democracy at work fallacy. So, the idea that it's just democracy working. And I think it's much more complex than this.
Thank you. So I think Hugo has a question.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm also following the class that you're teaching from Argentina, but it's good to see you live because with the time difference, I don't get to see you, and so I can ask questions. I wanted to ask you something specifically about the Argentine case and the federal structure of the country, because that's also something that comes up on the literature on the US. Can we talk about one national penal field, or is it 50 different ones? I was wondering, what were your thoughts on the same topic in Argentina? How do we see this exchange between the federal level and the provincial level? How is it that sometimes we might have a punitive discourse at the federal level, but we might have governors that try to pull back? And how's the discussion between those two levels? If you could maybe touch a little bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. It's a very interesting question. And as you said, the debate on the USA in the last 15 years has shown us the importance of the sub-national level in the federal states. In the case of Argentina, it's not exactly the same as in the US, because our provinces do not produce a penal code, but they have a jurisdiction on police forces and on criminal justice institutions. So they have a lot of power in producing penal policy. So, and we need to include that variable in our analysis. I didn't do it in this presentation at all, but it's key. It's very, very important, because we tend to elaborate our ideas around a set of jurisdictions in Argentina. That means the Buenos Aires province, our state of Sao Paulo, to make a comparison with Brazil, the biggest province with the biggest prison population, with the federal level, and probably with some other provinces that are in the center of the country, as Santa Fe and Cordoba, and that's it. And we have provinces today in Argentina that have Scandinavian incarceration rates. So today we have provinces with 60 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants, but we don't know much about what is going on there in order to understand this. And I think that that's a huge challenge. And I think for the research on the Argentinian case is a key development in the near future, but also for Brazil, another case in which, the consideration of the differences between the states is not so strong in our debate about what has been going on with penal policy in Brazil. And I think it's completely crucial for the next, let's say, generation of the studies in our own context, because if not, we think that Sao Paulo is the same as Acre or Rondonia, and we really do not understand a lot what is going on if we think in that way. So I think it's a crucial element, and this exercise of penal geography inside our countries is probably the next step we have to take in order to understand better what has happened with penal metamorphosis.
Great. We have quite a few questions now, so maybe we could take two at a time. Firstly, Erika and Felipe, if you both, Erika, if you go first.
Thank you, Oli. Gracias, Máximo, por la presentación. I wanted to ask a question about human rights discourses. That you mentioned by the end that human rights has had a role in criminal justice legislation, I think you mentioned. But I was wondering, because the human rights discourse in Argentina is so tied to the dictatorship and the post kind of dictatorial legacy, I was wondering how the human rights discourse has played a role in punitiveness, particularly perhaps in the 1990s and perhaps since 2003, to pick both moments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Felipe as well, if you could ask. No?
Maximo, thank you very much for that illuminating talk. I think very interesting. I have a question about, I suppose, Colombia, where there has been an increase of incarceration from 2000 to 2018, or more than double the population, but also a change in the prison system, sort of moving towards privatization. And I'm wondering whether there is something to do with that and the increased capacity to incarcerate because of the privatization of the prisons.
Thank you very much for these two very interesting questions. Erika, I think that we have to understand better the connection between human rights movement and penal policy in general in the last 30 years in Latin America. My own visions about it are that first, we need to consider the struggle by human rights organizations during the 1980s around crimes of the state as a very strong force against the possibility of building a punitive discourse around street crime in the beginning of the transition to democracy. I think that these key actors in the public debate really produce a strong effect, in some way making very difficult for political actors, but of course for members of the penal institutions like police officers or prison officers to speak out loud a punitive language in the 1980s in Argentina. And I think that this influence in some way continue throughout time. It's, for my perspective, it's not at all casual that at the beginning of the Kirchnerist government in 2003, the alliance between strong a great part of the human rights organizations and this governmental alliance produced some blockage of the uses of the punitive discourses in several sectors of this heterogeneous political alliance. We are talking about, the Kirchnerism that was in the process of construction, because as you know, and everybody knows, the construction of the alliance in the case of Kirchnerism was after the process of winning the election and not before. It's a very interesting case of how this the network of support of this new program was built from the presidency after winning the election. And I think that this is very important to understand things that have had a very important symbolic and practical effect. The first one, of course, the most important one, was the promotion of the prosecution and punishment of crimes of the state. That was part of and parcel of the political program of the Kirchnerist Alliance. We cannot consider this element without understanding this strong alliance. And I think it's not casual that in that moment, the discourses from professional politicians were openly more moderate around crime and punishment, particularly inside the Kirchnerist Alliance. But after this first moment with this punitive populist trend from below around the Bloomberg case, you can see how inside the alliance there are differences between the different actors. And I think that this heterogeneity was also a substantial element of all the Kirchnerist experience. So for example, we can consider this example that is a very, very small one, I promise. In 2006, the Ministry of Justice built a commission in order to reform entirely the criminal code. and building a new criminal code, a commission of experts with professors of criminal law from different universities. And they produced what we call in Spanish an anteproyecto. That means not a bill, but a design that could be transformed in a bill to send to the Federal Congress. And when you look at that project, this anteproyecto, it was a very progressive one with a lot of measures of decriminalization, for example, of abortion, and several other moderations of penalties, and including, for example, a whole range of alternatives to prison as a sentence. So what has happened then? After this anteproyecto was built, other actors, beginning with the Ministry of Justice, a very conservative actor, I have to say, that is still there, blocked completely this anteproyecto. And so you can see the internal struggles of the Kirchnerism in this example very, very clearly. And we can come back to this in 2012, 2014, with what has been called the Zaffaroni Penal Code, another example of a progressive attempt to reform criminal law that was blocked, first by the internal struggles inside Kirchnerism, and also by the work through the work of the opposition. So I think that there is a connection between prosecution and punishment of crimes of the state, of the last dictatorship, and moderation of penal policy. That is quite not common sense for many observers from other places, because somebody could say, well, prosecution and punishment of somebody is part, of a punitive mentality. But we are talking about the punishment of state officers that have produced violations of human rights. So the language is a language of moderation of the state, of limitation of the state, even through punishment. So this peculiar connection, I think it's crucial to understand Argentinian story. Thank you, Erika, for the question. And Felipe, I think that, well, Colombian case is fascinating for many, many reasons. As several colleagues from Colombia that have worked around penal policy changes in the last 30 years in Colombia, of course, we can see the strong influence of the US federal government, the Plan Colombia, and many other ideas and measures that have been taken during these 30 years. And one is, of course, the increased level of state capacity in order to prosecute and punish offenders. So in the case of the prosecution, it's clearly the example of the criminal justice reform that have introduced a strong translation of plea bargaining from the American criminal law into Colombia that produced a lot of cases that are sentenced through this kind of mechanism without a public trial. And this has been a key element in producing a huge level of offenders that were condemned to prison. And the other side was building prisons. So if I went to La Modelo once in many years ago, and you imagine that prison in Bogota as a prison that had a lot of elements that in common with many other prisons in Latin America, old buildings with a lot of course of problems of infrastructure, with a lot of problems of guards in order to try to govern what is going on inside prisons and so on and so forth. But now you have these supermax prisons imported in their design from the US. So I think it's a fantastic process. When I mentioned briefly that, of course, we have to recognize the importation of discourses and practices from the US in order to understand the punitive term, this is one fantastic example, but we have to do more research in order to understand how far it goes, because we have a couple of papers in the last 10 years. Fiona Macaulay from the UK have written a very interesting paper in 2013 about the importation of supermax models in Latin America, particularly in Brazil. But we still need more research to be done, because if we consider the case of Argentina, for example, well, there have been some attempts, some ideas have circulated, but but with a very moderate effect. But in the case of Colombia, you can see the opposite thing. So in that sense, privatization as a source of capacity of, in this case, punishing people by incarcerating them, I think it's a very interesting element. In many cases, built out of a language that is not an openly punitive language. It's not, a language about being hard with criminals. It's a language about producing good prison conditions, decent prison conditions for decent lives for prisoners. So it's quite complex, in which you can see paradoxical effects, as in the criminal justice reform, that I think it's a fascinating example of the same thing. We began this process of criminal justice reform in the name of democracy, rule of law, and the rights of the accused and the rights of the prisoner. But we introduced this new public management language and its preoccupation with efficacy and efficiency. And now we have 95%, for example, in my province, 98% of people condemned to prison through plea bargaining. So all the, let's say, the main features of the criminal justice that has been promised by the movement of reform disappear completely, because we have a secret proceedings with a huge power by prosecutors. So several of the features that are typical of our critique of the inquisitorial model since the 1980s in Latin America.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions, one from Isabel and one from Alison Liebling. If you'd like to read them out, please do. Otherwise, I'm very happy to read them.
Sorry, it's in the chat, isn't it?
Oh, no, I'm speaking to Isabel and Alison themselves if they'd like to read out the questions. But if not, I'm very happy to.
¿Qué opinas sobre la judicialización de la política que ha multiplicado los niveles de punitiveness en el caso específico de Bolivia? Well, I think it's very interesting to discuss about how much effect the process of lawfare and judicialization of politics have produced incarceration and incarceration effects. We can be very critical of these dynamics and processes, and we can be very critical in some cases and not in some others. But I think that we have to separate this from the effects in prison populations, because the effect in prison populations is quite marginal in general. I do not know the peculiar features of this in Bolivia, but I think that in the other countries in which I know better the composition of the prison population, you cannot see a lot of elements of this prosecution and punishment of political opponents as part and parcel of the growth of the incarceration rate. And there is another comment question by Alison. I can read it, Oliver. It's there.
No, unless Alison wants to, I'm very happy to. Yeah.
Well, only to say, fantastic talk, Maximo, before you start, and just how mind-boggling it is to try and get your head around 18 different countries. So, I mean, this is too stimulating. There's lots of questions, including one about Chile and privatization, and yet having one of the lower rates of increase, and yet being one of the early adopters. So there's all sorts of things. But my question that I sent was about when you talked about the trends from below concept. You were obviously referring mainly to public discourse, but I was thinking about what was going on inside prisons and what the relationship is between all of that and the story you're telling. So does this include the political energy, organization of prisoners? What's their mood? We hear some things even from a distance. So do the imprisoned change their character or their levels of resistance or resignation alongside the changing politics and public discourse that you're describing?
Thank you very much, Alison. It's a great point. I think it's we can see the effects of mobilization by prisoners in the case of Argentina in several moments throughout this history. So one important moment was the beginning of the 1990s, in which several riots produced by prisoners in the federal prisons and in the Buenos Aires province prisons really put in the public agenda the question of prison on remand and its very, very long periods of time. And this produced a response by the elites and the Federal Congress, producing a law that was considered the 2-for-1 law that enables many, many people that were incarcerated in that moment to leave the prison using this benefit of after, spending a long period of time on prison remand. So this was a very interesting example of the past. And a very important example in the present is related with COVID-19 crisis and what has been going on in prisons. So since March 2020, we have had a lot of protests by different movements and groups of prisoners in Argentinian prisons, because the first decision was, of course, to close prisons to everybody coming from the outside world. So, for example, we teach courses from the university inside prison, we could not enter the prison till the end of the year, till December 2020. But if we understand how the prison authorities has changed their measures, we need to consider that protest, that movement from below that were really, really strong in some cases, and made the need to open at least some level of activities, and particularly and mainly the visit by families. That is a huge, important thing for, of course, for all the prisoners around the world, but particularly in the case of Argentina, because survival inside prisons is related to the goods that families could take with them inside the prison. So this is another interesting example. When I use the expression from below previously as answering the question by Oliver, I was thinking of these movements around the figure of the victim and so on and so forth. But of course, there are other movements from below that have produced some level of impact. We don't have a Black Lives Matters movement of this, let's say, this strength and this huge amount of cultural and political effects. But we could also see different kinds of actors, mainly related, going back to the question of Erika, to the human rights language, but also many social movements in Argentina that are increasingly adopting a critical position in relation to punitive policies, but still are, let's say, quite weak in order to enter into the political and public arena and discourse. But in some occasions, they produce some certain amount of influence. And I think we also need to pay more attention to this, particularly when we go down to the microphysics of everyday life inside prisons. I think it's completely crucial.
Great. Do we have any more questions?
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, good.
You just mentioned something about the movement around the figure of the victim. Could you say a bit more what you meant by that?
Sorry, Erika, I didn't hear you. Can you speak more loudly?
You just mentioned something about a movement around the figure of the victim, right? You just said something like that. Could you just clarify what you meant? Because I was a bit unsure.
Well, I was thinking about the moment that we talk about it with the question of Oliver. This beginning of the 2000s and the Bloomberg case and all the social movement around this figure of the victim that have persisted in Argentina, but although with a increasingly and with an obviously decrease of influence and strength in the political arena. So that moment of a strong influence have in some way been eroded through these years. Although we have several movements around victims of crime, victims of insecurity, they are not so strong in the public and political debate, although of course they are actors and they play different roles in the public and political arena.
Thank you.
Right. Any more questions? Yeah, Hugo?
If we still have a little bit of time, I just wanted to ask you a question. Well, going back to the Argentinian case. So usually, you know, people talk about the transition from neoliberalism to post-neoliberalism, from Menemismo to Kirchnerismo, but it seems to me like people often forget the whole, you know, 99 to 2003 period of huge political, social, economic crisis. And when you look at the number, it's really in that period that you have a really important increase in the prison population. And I was wondering if, you know, from your point of view, it's kind of a continuation of what happened in the last years of Menem's government, or is there another dynamic that's at play that's linked to, you know, state crisis, etc., in this very relatively brief but very intense period of acute crisis?
Very, very interesting point. You know, when Loïc Vaquant has published in French Les Prisons de la Misère in 1999, after that, 1 year after that, he came to Buenos Aires to present his book in Spanish, Las Prisiones de la Miseria. And when he arrived here in 2000, just in this moment that you are mentioning, he said, well, this is a perfect example of the combination between neoliberalism and punitive term. And of course, I agree that we have to consider seriously the economic and social neoliberal policies that were implemented by Menem's governments that have produced a huge amount of social, economic, and cultural effects in terms of increasing poverty, increasing unemployment, increasing inequality. And I think it's crucial in order to understand also the growth of crime, of street crime that I believe that has been produced during those years. I don't think that it was, you know, an invention of crime statistics, or I think it was a real phenomenon that produced a strong, also again, social and cultural effects. But I think that in order to understand how this same governmental alliance that produced these neoliberal reforms since 1989 have begun to promote punitive policies, we have to understand two things. First, that as a governmental alliance was not only a neoliberal alliance, was also a neoconservative alliance. I think that we don't have to think, I don't agree with Vaquant about his concept of neoliberalism. That is a refined version of what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism as a political rationality, I think, has a lot to do with the punitive term in its beginning in Argentina, both but mainly in an indirect way, producing several effects in the economic and social field. And I think that the neoconservative soul of Menemism is very important to understand the punitive term also, because if we do not understand the role of ex-military officers and ex-police officers inside Menem government and how they influence the birth of this rhetoric of being this mano dura rhetoric, I think that we lose sight of a very, very important element. We could not consider these actors as part of a neoliberal ethos, an international neoliberal ethos. We can consider these actors, from my perspective, in a more clear way, as part and parcel of the legacies of the past, you know, of the dictatorship and the long history of authoritarianism in Argentina. So, and I think that this paradoxical alliance between neoliberal economic and social reforms with the emergence of this neoconservative language first and then initiatives is the best way to understand what has been going on in that moment, this punitive populism from above, as I labeled in some texts. But then I think that if we consider the political change, I think that your question is probably one of the most important questions for all Latin American countries that have experienced these processes. Because in the promise of post-neoliberalism, the criminal question, crime and punishment, was not part of it. You know, when you look at the discourses of the main leaders, you look at the discourses of the main actors in these governmental alliances, from President Chavez to President Kirchner, you will see that crime and punishment was not part of a main part of their discourse. So when they were talking about reversing the larga noche neoliberal, you know, the long neoliberal night, as Rafael Correa has put it, they were not considering the issue of crime and punishment as part of this reversal, of this change. There were other themes in their political discourse. So this gave room, to a huge level of heterogeneity inside these political alliances. So in the case of Argentina, you could consider in the beginning of the Kirchnerist process, the participation of human rights organizations as, I don't know, Abuelas y Madres de Plaza de Mayo, with the participation of Miguel Pichetto, as you know, as a very clearly conservative actor with a very clearly conservative discourse on crime and punishment. And there were two parts of the same political alliance. So I think that the effects of the punitive term in the effects of punitive populism from below since the second half of the 1990s were then difficult to dismantle. You know, this song, How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb. So it's very difficult to dismantle the combination of elements. And I think that these political alliances really, some sectors of them really wanted to dismantle this bomb of punitive populism, but they were not capable of doing it because they were, and the main reason was that several parts of their own governmental alliances were committed to that other kind of trend. And I think that these struggles inside these governmental alliances really explains a lot of what has happened. But at the end of the day, we can consider that this struggle inside the Kirchnerist political process have produced, during 12 years, an increase of 23% of the incarceration rate. So the previous trend was a 93% increase in only 8 years. So you can consider that this political struggle have produced some moderating effects in the punitive trend. And that's why with President Macri and a political alliance without all these conflicts and struggles, with a political alliance clearly linked to a punitive discourse and proposals, we can see this huge increase in the incarceration rate in the last 4 years. So when I said a more substantively political account of penalty, I am referring to these kind of things.
That's great, thank you. Probably would have one more question if anyone wants to, but if not, can start wrapping up. So thank you, Maximo, so much for a really, really interesting presentation and a really rich discussion. I think it's been great. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you very much, Felipe, and everybody. Muchas gracias a todas y a todos. It was very interesting. Thank you very much for your questions and comments.
Muchas gracias, Máximo.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Oliver. Thank you.